Chapter 2. The Gentleman with Crape on his Hat. It was the 3rd of July. The heat and stuffiness were insufferable. The day had been a very busy one for Velchaninov. He had had to spend the whole morning in walking and driving from place to place, and he had before him the prospect of an unavoidable visit that evening to a gentleman, a lawyer and a civil councillor, whom he hoped to catch unawares at his villa out of town. At 6 o'clock, Velchaninov went at last into a restaurant. The fare was not beyond criticism, though the cooking was French, on the Nevsky Prospect, near the police bridge. He sat down at the little table in his usual corner and asked for the dinner of the day. He used to eat the dinner that was provided for a ruble, and paid extra for the wine, and he regarded this as a sacrifice to the unsettled state of his finances, and an act of prudence on his part. Though he wondered how he could possibly eat such stuff, he nevertheless used to devour it to the last crumb, and every time with as much appetite as though he had not eaten for 3 days before. "There's something morbid about it," he would mutter to himself sometimes, noticing his appetite. But on this occasion he took his seat at his little table in a very bad humor, tossed his hat down angrily, put his elbows on the table, and sank into thought. Though he could be so polite and, on occasion, so loftily imperturbable, he would probably now, if someone dining near him had been noisy, or the boy waiting on him had failed to understand at the first word, have been as blustering as a Junker, and would perhaps have made a scene. The soup was put before him. He took up the ladle, but before he had time to help himself, he dropped it, and almost jumped up from the table. A surprising idea suddenly dawned upon him, at that instant, and God knows by what process. He suddenly realized the cause of his depression, of the special extra depression which had tormented him of late for several days together, had for some unknown reason fastened upon him, and for some unknown cause refused to be shaken off. Now he suddenly saw it all, and it was as plain as a pikestaff. "It's all that hat," he muttered, as though inspired. "It's nothing but that cursed bowler hat, with that beastly mourning crape that is the cause of it all." He began pondering, and the more he pondered, the more morose he grew, and the more extraordinary the whole adventure seemed to him. "But it is not an adventure, though," he protested, distrustful of himself. "As though there were anything in the least like an adventure about it." All that had happened was this. Nearly a fortnight before, he did not really remember, but he fancied it was about a fortnight, he had first met, somewhere in the street, near the corner of Podyacheski Street and Mieszczansky Street, a gentleman with crape on his hat. The gentleman was like anyone else. There was nothing peculiar about him. He passed quickly, but he stared somewhat too fixedly at Velchaninov, and for some reason at once attracted his attention in a marked degree. His countenance struck Velchaninov as familiar. He had certainly at some time met it somewhere. "But I must have seen thousands of faces in my life. I can't remember them all." Before he had gone 20 paces further, he seemed to have forgotten the encounter, in spite of the impression made at first. But the impression persisted the whole day, and it was somewhat singular. It took the form of a peculiar, undefined annoyance. Now, a fortnight later, he remembered all that distinctly. He remembered, too, what he had failed to grasp at the time, that is, what his annoyance was due to. And he had so utterly failed to grasp it that he had not even connected his ill humor all that evening with the meeting that morning. But the gentleman had lost no time in recalling himself to Velchaninov's mind, and next day had come across the latter in the Nevsky Prospect again, and again stared at him rather strangely. Velchaninov dismissed him with a curse, and immediately afterwards wondered why he cursed. It is true that there are faces that at once arouse an undefined and aimless aversion. "Yes, I certainly have met him somewhere," he muttered thoughtfully, an hour after the meeting. And he remained in a very bad humor the whole evening afterwards. He even had a bad dream at night. And yet it never entered his head that the whole cause of this new fit of despondency was nothing but that gentleman in mourning, although he did not once think of him that evening. He had even been wrathful at the moment that such a wretched object could occupy his attention as long as it did, and would certainly have thought it degrading to ascribe his agitation to him, if it had ever occurred to his mind to do so. 2 days later, they met again in a crowd coming off one of the Nevsky steamers. On this third occasion, Velchaninov was ready to swear that the gentleman with the crape on his hat recognized him and made a dash for him, but was borne away in the crush. He fancied he had even had the effrontery to hold out his hand to him. Perhaps he had even cried out and shouted his name. That, however, Velchaninov had not heard distinctly, but, "Who is the low fellow, though? And why does he not come up to me if he really does know me, and if he is so anxious to?" he thought angrily, as he got into a cab and drove towards Smolny Monastery. Half an hour later, he was noisily arguing with his lawyer, but in the evening and the night he was suffering again from the most abominable and most fantastic attack of acute depression. "Am I in for a bilious attack?" he wondered uneasily, looking at himself in the looking-glass. This was the third meeting. Afterwards, for 5 days in succession, he met no one, and not a sign was seen of the low fellow. And yet the gentleman with the crape on his hat was continually in his mind. With some surprise, Velchaninov caught himself wondering, "What's the matter with me? Am I sick on his account, or what? And he must have a lot to do in Petersburg, too. And for whom is he wearing crape? He evidently recognized me, but I don't recognize him. And why do these people put on crape? It's out of keeping with him somehow. I fancy if I look at him closer, I shall recognize him." And something seemed faintly stirring in his memory, like some familiar but momentarily forgotten word, which one tries with all one's might to recall. One knows it very well, and knows that one knows it. One knows exactly what it means, one is close upon it, and yet it refuses to be remembered, in spite of one's efforts. It was long ago, and it was somewhere. There was... But damn the fellow, whatever there was or wasn't, he cried angrily all at once. It is not worth while to demean and degrade myself over that wretched fellow. He grew horribly angry, but in the evening, when he suddenly remembered that he had been angry that morning, and horribly angry, it was extremely disagreeable to him. He felt as though someone had caught him in something shameful. He was bewildered and surprised. Then there must be reasons for my being so angry. Apropos of nothing. At a mere reminiscence. He left the thought unfinished. And next day he felt angrier than ever, but this time he fancied he had grounds for it, and that he was quite right in feeling so. It was unheard of insolence, he thought. What had happened was the fourth meeting. The gentleman with crape on his hat had suddenly made his appearance again, as though he had sprung out of the earth. Velchaninov had just caught in the street the indispensable civil councillor, before mentioned, of whom he was still in pursuit, meaning to pounce on him unawares at his summer villa, for the gentleman, whom Velchaninov scarcely knew, though it was so necessary to see him about his business, on that occasion, as on this, eluded him, and was evidently keeping out of sight, and extremely reluctant to meet him. Delighted at coming across him at last, Velchaninov walked hurriedly beside him, glancing into his face, and straining every effort to bring the wily old fellow to the discussion of a certain subject, in which the latter might be indiscreet enough to let slip the facts of which he had so long been on the track. But the crafty old man had his own views, and kept putting him off with laughter or silence, and it was just at this extremely absorbing moment that Velchaninov descried on the opposite pavement the gentleman with crape on his hat. He was standing, staring at them both. He was watching them, that was evident, and seemed to be jeering at them. "Damnation!" cried Velchaninov in a fury, as he left the civil councillor at his destination, and ascribed his failure with him to the sudden appearance of that impudent fellow. "Damnation! Is he spying on me? He's evidently following me. Hired by someone, perhaps, and by Jove, he was jeering at me. By Jove, I'll thrash him. I'm sorry I've no stick with me. I'll buy a stick. I won't let it pass. Who is he? I insist on knowing who he is." It was 3 days after this fourth meeting that Velchaninov was at his restaurant, as we have described him, agitated in earnest, and even somewhat overwhelmed. He could not help being conscious of it himself, in spite of his pride. He was forced at last, putting all the circumstances together, to suspect that all his depression, all this peculiar despondency, and the agitation that had persisted for the last fortnight, was caused by no other than this gentleman in mourning, nonentity as he was. "I may be a hypochondriac," thought Velchaninov, "and so I am ready to make a mountain out of a molehill, but does it make it any the better for me that all this is perhaps only fancy? Why, if every rogue like that is going to be able to upset one in this way, Certainly, in the meeting of that day, the 5th, which had so agitated Velchaninov, the mountain had proved to be little more than a molehill. The gentleman had, as before, darted by him, but this time without scrutinizing Velchaninov, and without, as before, betraying that he recognized him. On the contrary, he dropped his eyes, and seemed to be very anxious to escape being noticed. Velchaninov turned round, and shouted at the top of his voice, "Hi! You with the crape on your hat! Hiding now! Stop! Who are you?" The question, and his shouting altogether, was very irrational, but Velchaninov only realized that after he had uttered it. The gentleman turned round at the shout, stood still for a moment disconcerted, smiled, seemed on the point of doing or saying something, was obviously for a minute in a state of the utmost indecision. Then he suddenly turned and rushed away without looking back. Velchaninov looked after him with astonishment. "And what if it's a case of my forcing myself on him, not his forcing himself on me?" he thought, "and that's all it amounts to." When he had finished dinner, he made haste to set off to the summer villa to see the civil councillor. He did not find him. He was informed that his honour had not returned that day, and probably would not come back till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, as he was staying in town to a birthday party. This was so mortifying that, in his first fury, Velchaninov decided himself to go to the birthday party, and even set off to do so. But reflecting on the road that it was a long way to go, he dismissed the cab and trudged home on foot to his flat near the Grand Theatre. He felt that he wanted exercise. He must, at all costs, overcome his usual sleeplessness, and sleep sound that night, to soothe his excited nerves. And in order to sleep, he must anyway be tired. And, as it was a long walk, it was 10:30 before he reached home, and he certainly was very tired. Though he so criticized the flat that he had taken the previous March, and abused it so malignantly, excusing himself to himself on the plea that he was only camping there temporarily, and stranded in Petersburg through that damned lawsuit, the flat was by no means so bad and so unsuitable as he made out. The approach was certainly rather dark and grubby under the gateway, but the flat itself, on the second story, consisted of 2 big, lofty, and bright rooms, separated from one another by a dark entry, and looking one into the street, the other into the courtyard. Adjoining the room, the windows of which looked into the courtyard, was a small study, which had been designed for a bedroom. But Velchaninov kept it littered with books and papers. He slept in one of the larger rooms, the one that looked into the street. He had a bed made up on the sofa. The furniture was quite decent, though second-hand, and he had besides a few articles of value, the relics of his former prosperity, bronze and china, and big, genuine Bokhara rugs. Even 2 good pictures had been preserved. But everything had been unmistakably untidy, and even dusty, and nothing had been put in its place ever since his servant, Pelageya, had gone home to Novgorod for a holiday and left him alone. The oddity of having a solitary female servant for a bachelor and man of the world who was still anxious to keep up the style of a gentleman almost made Velchaninov blush, though he was very well satisfied with his Pelageya. The girl had come to him when he was taking the flat in the spring, from a family of his acquaintance who were going abroad, and she had put the flat to rights. But when she went away, he could not bring himself to engage another woman. To engage a manservant was not worth while for a short time. Besides, he did not like men-servants. And so it was arranged that the sister of the porter's wife should come in every morning to clear up, and that Velchaninov should leave the key at the porter's lodge when he went out. She did absolutely nothing, merely pocketed her wages, and he suspected her of pilfering. Yet he dismissed everything with a shrug, and was positively glad that he was left quite alone in the flat. But there are limits to everything, and at some jaundiced moments the filth was absolutely insufferable to his nerves, and he almost always went into his rooms with a feeling of repugnance on returning home. But this time, he barely gave himself time to undress. Flinging himself on the bed, he irritably resolved to think of nothing, but to go to sleep this minute, whatever might happen. And, strange to say, he did fall asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. Such a thing had not happened to him for almost a month. He slept for nearly 3 hours, but his sleep was uneasy, and he had strange dreams, such as one has in fever. He dreamed of some crime which he had committed and concealed, and of which he was accused by people who kept coming up to him. An immense crowd collected, but more people still came, so that the door was not shut, but remained open. But his whole interest was centered on a strange person, once an intimate friend of his, who was dead, but now, somehow, suddenly came to see him. What made it most worrying was that Velchaninov did not know the man, had forgotten his name, and could not recall it. All he knew was that he had once liked him very much. All the other people who had come up seemed expecting from this man a final word that would decide Velchaninov's guilt or innocence, and all were waiting impatiently. But he sat at the table without moving, was mute, and would not speak. The noise did not cease for a moment. The general irritation grew more intense, and suddenly, in a fury, Velchaninov struck the man for refusing to speak, and felt a strange enjoyment in doing it. His heart thrilled with horror and misery at what he had done, but there was enjoyment in that thrill. Utterly exasperated, he struck him a second time, and a third, and, drunk with rage and terror, which reached the pitch of madness, but in which there was an intense enjoyment, he lost count of his blows, and went on beating him without stopping. He wanted to demolish it all. Suddenly, something happened. They all shrieked horribly, and turned round to the door, as though expecting something. And at that instant there came the sound of a ring at the bell, repeated 3 times, with violence enough to pull the bell off. Velchaninov woke up, and was wide awake in an instant. He leapt headlong out of bed, and rushed to the door. He was absolutely convinced that the ring at the bell was not a dream, and that someone really had rung at his bell that moment. It would be too unnatural for such a distinct, such a real, palpable ring to be only a dream. But to his surprise, the ring at the bell turned out to be a dream too. He opened the door, went out on the landing, even peeped down the stairs. There was absolutely no one there. The bell hung motionless. Surprised, but relieved, he went back into his room. When he had lighted a candle, he remembered that he had left the door closed, but not locked or bolted. He had sometimes in the past forgotten when he came home to lock the door for the night, not thinking it of much importance. Pelagia had often given him a talking to about it. He went back into the passage, shut the door, opened it once more, and looked out on the landing, but only fastened the door on the inside with the hook, without taking the trouble to turn the key. The clock struck 2:30, so he must have slept 3 hours. His dream had so disturbed him that he did not want to go to bed again at once, and made up his mind to walk up and down his room for half an hour or time enough to smoke a cigar, he thought. Hastily dressing, he went to the window and lifted the thick stuff curtain and the white blind behind it. It was already daylight in the street. The light summer nights of Petersburg always worked on his nerves, and of late had intensified his insomnia, so that it was expressly on this account that he had, a fortnight previously, put up thick stuff curtains which completely excluded the light when they were fully drawn. Letting in the daylight, and forgetting the lighted candle on the table, he fell to pacing up and down the room, still oppressed by a sort of sick and heavy feeling. The impression of the dream was still upon him. A real feeling of distress that he should have been capable of raising his hand against that man and beating him still persisted. That man doesn't exist, and never has existed. It's all a dream. Why am I worrying about it? He began thinking with exasperation, as though all his troubles were concentrated on this, that he was certainly beginning to be ill. A sick man. It was always painful to him to think that he was getting old and growing feebler, and in his bad moments he exaggerated his age and fading powers on purpose to irritate himself. "Old age," he muttered. "I'm getting quite old. I'm losing my memory. I see apparitions. I dream dreams. Bells ring. Damn it all. I know from experience that such dreams are always a sign of fever with me. I am convinced that all this business with the Crape gentleman is a dream too. I was certainly right yesterday. It's I who am pestering him, not he me. I've woven a romance about him, and I am hiding under the table in my fright at it. And why do I call him a low fellow? He may be a very decent person. His face is not attractive, certainly, though there is nothing particularly ugly about it. He's dressed like anyone else. Only in his eyes there's something. Here I'm at it again. I'm thinking about him again. What the devil does the look in his eyes matter to me? Can't I get on without that?" Among the thoughts that kept starting up in his mind, one rankled painfully. He felt suddenly convinced that this gentleman with the crape on his hat had once been an acquaintance on friendly terms with him, and now sneered at him when he met him because he knew some great secret about him in the past, and saw him now in such a humiliating position. He went mechanically to the window, meaning to open it and get a breath of the night air, and he suddenly shuddered all over. It seemed to him that something incredible and unheard of was suddenly happening before his eyes. He had not yet opened the window, but he made haste to slip behind the corner of the window and hide himself. On the deserted pavement opposite, he had suddenly seen, directly facing the house, the man with the crape on his hat. The gentleman was standing on the pavement looking towards his windows, but evidently not noticing him, stared inquisitively at the house, as though considering something. He seemed to be deliberating and unable to decide. He lifted his hand, and seemed to put his finger to his forehead. At last he made up his mind, took a cursory glance round, and began stealthily on tiptoe crossing the street. Yes, he had gone in at the gateway by the little gate, which sometimes in summer was left unbolted till 3 o'clock. "He's coming to me," flashed on Velchaninov's mind, and, also on tiptoe, he ran headlong to the door and stood before it, silent and numb with suspense, softly laying his trembling right hand on the hook of the door he had just fastened, listening intently for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. His heart beat so violently that he was afraid he might not hear the stranger come up on tiptoe. He did not understand what it meant, but he felt it all with tenfold intensity. His dream seemed to have melted into reality. Velchaninov was, by temperament, bold. He sometimes liked to display fearlessness in the face of danger, even if he were only admiring himself with no one else to look at him. But now there was something else as well. The man who had so lately been given up to hypochondria and nervous depression was completely transformed. He was not the same man. A nervous, noiseless laugh broke from him. From behind the closed door, he divined every movement of the stranger. "Ah! Now he's coming in. He has come in. He's looking about him. He's listening downstairs. He's holding his breath. Stealing up. Ah! He has taken hold of the handle. He's pulling it. Trying it. He reckoned on its not being locked. So he knows I sometimes forget to lock it. He's pulling at the handle again. Why does he imagine that the hook will come out? It's a pity to part. Isn't it a pity to let him go like this?" And indeed, everything must have happened just as he pictured it. Someone really was standing on the other side of the door, and was softly and noiselessly trying the lock, and was pulling at the handle, and, of course, had his object in doing so. But by now Velchaninov had resolved to settle the question, and with a sort of glee got ready for the moment. He had an irresistible longing to unfasten the hook, suddenly to fling open the door, and to confront the bugbear face to face. "What may you be doing here, pray, honored sir?" And so he did. Seizing the moment, he suddenly lifted the hook, pushed the door, and almost fell over the gentleman with crape on his hat.